Just a super quick introduction. Clara did a great job, but I am Gainsight's Chief of Staff to the CEO. And then the other chapter of my title is Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations. And for anybody who's in the Chief of Staff role, I think it's almost like a comedy act trying to come up with an abstract or a title that encompasses all of the amazing things you do. Because I think all of you are probably particularly good at your jobs and particularly agile, so you end up taking on more and more. So it's a little bit of a running joke on our team of, like what combo platter of titles are we going to use today. And then on the next slide, just a little bit of personal information. I split my time between these two wonderful places. On the left is Mansfield Center, Connecticut, which is like deep in the boonies, middle of nowhere, total farm town. If you know Connecticut at all, it's near the University of Connecticut, which is our only claim to fame, that and the cows. And then I also live in New York City, in the Chelsea area. So it's a nice little dichotomy of experiences. Awesome. And then on the next slide, just to kind of launch into it, these are my two little nieces. And so the other day I asked them, what do I do for work? And what does Chief of Staff do? And I think honestly, it's such a misunderstood role. I'm sure a lot of you who are going into the role are getting kind of different opinions about what a Chief of Staff does. And I'm sure every time you look at a job description, it says something a little different. And for those of you who are in the role, like me, a lot of times, and this isn't just restricted to parents and friends, but I think people in another corporate environment say, what is your job? What does a Chief of Staff do? And there's a whole kind of diversity of opinion. So this is a little bit tongue in cheek here, but it is pretty comical. My personal favorite is you sit at a pewter all day long and place calls. So I feel like there's a lesson in there somewhere about agility and how you describe what you're doing. And then on the next slide, this is just a little bit of a snapshot of what I promised to go over. And in true, I think, kind of candor and vulnerability, Clara did such a nice job with this abstract. I read it, and I think there's like there's a lesson in being kind of a lifelong learner and this role consistently changing over time. Because I read it and I said, God, I'd love to attend that session. Who has the answer to that? And so I hope a lot of you will participate and share thoughts in the chat and give me feedback at the end of it, and participate in Q&A. Feel free to come off mute and interrupt me anytime, because I think we're kind of learning and co-creating as we go. It's such a nascent role in the industry. And I think it's a pretty nascent role in the political and military environment, which I think is really the catalyst for how this kind of right-hand person to a principal or a CEO or a department head really came to be. So a quick snapshot you're seeing here, we'll talk kind of about this first chapter, which is how do you establish the need for a Chief of Staff? What catalyzes, what do you need to be thinking about if you are a principal or you're working at a company where you believe there needs to be a Chief of Staff at a CEO level or a departmental level? And how might you kind of meet the needs of that and make the case there? So I think you could kind of take hopefully the learnings there from whatever angle. And then delivering, now you're in this job. So how do you create impact by focusing your priorities on the right things and kind of delivering the fundamentals? How do you think about defining the scope of your job and kind of at what altitude you're performing in it? And then finally, there's this whole concept of scaling, which I'm really in that journey right now too. And I'm exploring how you expand your scope. How do you transition from this Chief of Staff, maybe a senior individual contributor role, having a lot of impact, to having a more scaled office of the CEO. Maybe you have direct reports. And so maybe some of us are kind of in that zone too. So on the next slide, I want to use the chat and get everybody involved since you're all so active, which makes me so happy. There's nothing worse than no one commenting. So thanks for throwing me a bone here. So since we can't have a coffee chat at a coffee shop, I've got a coffee on the screen here. So I'd love to hear from you all. What's the number one question you get about your job? I think there's a lot of, so feel free to drop that in the chat. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of overlap. I think for me, it is the basic fundamental. I love this. What is it you really do? Are you an assistant? Oh my God, I get that one all the time. There's like there's a brand exercise. So I hear a lot about assistant. people want to map it to a job that already exists that they can put in a neat and tidy box, and that is not this job. I often also personally hear a lot of, what do you actually do? What is your job? Lots of parallels with the HR department too. That happens for me as well. These are so good. I don't see what you're doing. Yeah, so visibility. And I think also this goes back, that's such a good one, Susan. This goes back, I think, to how you might get some structure around describing what it is you do at what altitude, the kind of impact that your teams and peers and other leaders can expect from you. So I hope that as we go through this, maybe some of this will provide a little bit of a framework, as it did for me. So let's move on to this first category we talked about, which is defining the role. Like I was telling you about, this whole chief of staff thing, I think, is still pretty nascent. It literally was a title that was formalized in government in the 60s. So when you look at it in the scope of time, it's actually this really new role. And then it's even more recent, probably in the past 10 years or so, this idea of a chief of staff in a business environment. And then I think even more recently than that, we've really formalized the title and started to formalize a different kind of combo platter of what the scope of this role really entails. And so it's unique to the company, it's unique to the leader. How I might define my job is going to be different than you, but let's take a stab at it anyway. So we'll move on to the first component of what I wanted to talk about. And so I think whether you are, like I said, wanting to aspire to be a chief of staff, currently a chief of staff, or you are a principal, a CEO, a department leader, a team leader, and you believe you need a chief of staff, there's kind of a certain set of 5 things that I would suggest you, in whatever capacity you are, look at. The first one is, does your team or company have a high volume of parallel strategic initiatives at play? So those could be launching a product. It could be preparing to do M&A. There could be operational projects like running the board of directors or launching a strategic advisory board. So you're looking to see if a lot of these different strategic projects are trying to run in parallel to make the company successful. And then number 2 is almost like a 1A here, which is there's a lot of these happening and they don't always have a departmental owner. And so you see this a lot at growing and scaling companies that just what you're producing, the team that you have in place hasn't quite caught up to the projects and the programs that you're running. And so having someone in a chief of staff, this centralized function to almost deploy out into these initiatives, can be super beneficial. The third is your market and your team and your company are super rapidly changing, and it's scaling and growing like crazy. And maybe you don't know how to use this person yet, but we know they're going to add a lot of value. 4 is super simple. You're jam-packed and maybe your schedule lacks intentionality. And then the last one is, I think, a lot of companies think about this after. The culture happens really organically when you're a 100, 200, 300 person company. You start scaling and the intentionality behind culture and mission and values often, I think, becomes reactive instead of proactive. So I think this individual can also play a really important role in that. And then on the next slide, this is actually a quote from my CEO. Literally 6 years ago, he had a conversation with someone and he said, I believe a chief of staff is a force multiplier for the CEO's strategic value. And I think this is such an important takeaway because whoever your principal is, mine happens to be the CEO in this case, is such an important evangelist in terms of the altitude that you are expected to perform and how you're presented, I think, to the rest of the team. And so this, I think, does a really good job of defining what a versatile role and the level of strategic impact it can have. So on the next slide, I'm just going to break it down into an a la carte menu of 3 options, if you will. So I'm going to imagine that a lot of you have come across this HBR article called The Case for a Chief of Staff. If you haven't seen it, it's really, really good. The problem with it, though, is it levels the talent as a level 1, 2, and 3, which I think sort of implies that one level is better than another, when I think that the levels actually just serve different purposes for the type of leader and the scale of organization you have. So I've taken a little literary license here and I've created the 3 levels, if you will, or the 3 kind of menu options. So just to touch on them really quickly, this idea of a builder, the persona you might see, maybe they're someone a little bit earlier career, or they've come from an executive assistant role. where they're massively underutilized. They can add a lot more strategic value. And the expectations of this person are all around maximizing efficiency and optimizing time and really creating organizational structure and rhythm to how your principal is operating. And then the second category I would call the influencer. And so this might be someone who's mid-level. Maybe this person has an MBA and they're returning to work, a few years of work experience. I generally see them as a very strategic, super smart, but still an individual contributor. And they're often skiing alongside other departmental leaders or other senior executives to push these parallel projects forward, but maybe they don't necessarily own any of these strategic projects permanently on their team. And then there's the shaper. And I think this is someone who probably has more years of experience, has managed a team, maybe they've managed a department. Many years ago, I talked to a company called Gusto. They're a tech startup in Silicon Valley, really, really cool company. They do HR software. And the type of chief of staff they were looking for was someone who was running a 300-person department who they could basically deploy to a very fast growing set of department leaders to help coach them on how to scale their own departments. So it's a totally different format and level of need. And I think it all depends on what the leader needs and what kind of scale and size the company is. So on the next slide this is kind of, I think there's probably a combination. Maybe there are more options. I'd love to hear from you all if you think there are more options. But if I were to be really kind of black and white and break it down into two, the two tracks that I see for chief of staff when you're coming into the role, and these I think are good questions to offer or ask if you're entering the role, and some interesting ways to think about it if you're currently in the role or you're hiring for the role. A lot of companies do what I would call sort of a rotational stint. Maybe it's 18 to 24 months. Before I joined Gainsight, every chief of staff prior to me was in a rotational position. Perhaps the company's higher growth, they're going to have a lot more programs that kind of come in and out of the team, and you may need a different set of skills. So the chief of staff that was maybe 2 or 3 before me, my CEO, Nick, hired someone who had a ton of M&A experience because we were focused on M&A at that chapter of the company. And then when he looked to hire me, he was looking for someone more permanent who had a communications background, given the volume of communications that we do. So that chief of staff may then get absorbed into different functional areas of the business. Most of the chiefs of staff we've had at Gainsight are actually still at the company and have grown into other functional positions. And then there's permanent. I don't mean permanent as in you need to go into that job and you're going to be in that job for the rest of your life. I mean permanent as in there isn't a clean agreement around 18 to 24 months. And this is candidly what I sort of fell into. So I'm in this category where you have deeper functional experience. So I came in with a background in communications. And so I really serve that purpose there. And maybe there's an opportunity for this person to scale their role into an office of the CEO. And depending on the size of the company, I think there's a whole menu of different options that they could explore, perhaps C-suite, as they launch into other opportunities after they're done with this role. Let me pause there for a second. That was what I wanted to talk about in terms of just defining the role, questions to ask about when you need a chief of staff and how to think about defining your role and your level of impact. Anybody have any questions or comments before we go into the second section? All right. Cool. Okay, so chapter 2 is delivering. So now you're in the job and now we have to figure out how we actually prioritize what we do so that we have really focused work. So on the next slide are 5 ways to think about delivering focused priorities. There are probably 10 that we could all come up with together, but the 5 that I like to use coming into the role are a question around love and loathe. So what does your principal or your CEO need to focus on, but isn't good at, or they don't like to do it? And so for my example, I asked this question to Nick, our CEO, coming into the job. And I said, what do you love that you would love to have more kind of firepower around? What do you not like doing, but you know we need to do it as a business? And one of the things that he loves but doesn't like doing is creating process and prioritization around what we do. Because I think like many senior leaders, he's in this zone of, well, let's just do it all, which obviously is not super sustainable. And so one of the key objectives of my role is to create process and rigor around what we do and how it's scalable and things like that. Number 2 is a SWOT analysis. And so you could even do this in a super fundamental way, doing a SWOT analysis of your principal's calendar. And so you're looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Bain is really good at this. So if you ever want to just do a quick Google search, it'll give you templates and ways to actually kind of conduct it. And you can look at their calendar, how they're spending time, and create a narrative around what are they doing really well? What are the strong suits? Maybe they meet with tons of leaders from all over the world, so they're representing that really well. What are they missing? What are the weaknesses? What opportunities do we have to spend their time better and be more efficient? And then what are the threats to the company in how they're spending their time? So that's just one way to look at it. You could probably do a SWOT for other components of your principal, but I think the calendar is actually a really good, very educational way to get in there. Yeah, Trisha, the template, Bain, so B-A-I-N, if you type in Bain Consulting, they are particularly good at this, and I'll try and find one and I'll share it with Clara as well. Yeah, Susan, you got it. And then 3 is business goals. So you're looking, maybe you do objectives and key results, OKRs, a goal setting tool. We happen to use something called the one-page strategic plan. And just on one page, it essentially outlines what the business objectives are. What are the initiatives that we're going to focus on? And then what are the success metrics that tell us we've been successful in doing those? And so I look at those and I say, of the business goals that Gainsight needs to deliver on, what role can I play in helping to evangelize those and push those forward in my role? And if you don't know the answer, ask your principal. It's an awesome topic for discussion. And then 4 is your ability. So my strong suit coming in was around culture. It was around communication, bringing teams together, internal communications. And so I was able to lean in really quickly and offer a set of abilities that aligned with what my CEO needed. And then there's tons of stuff that I've now done that I joke that I have no business doing because I've never done before, which I also think is half of the chief of staff job. And then 5 is areas of acceleration. So maybe these are things that show up on the business goals, maybe they aren't, but what are the areas of the business that need you as the force multiplier? What strategic areas, what areas of the CEO's focus? All right, so on the next slide here, I'd love to open up to the chat again. What do you spend the majority of your time on? In the next part of the conversation, I'm just going to give you a quick sense of how I think the role could look and how it might evolve over time. So as I said, when I joined this role, I probably spent over half of my time doing communications focused work. That's vastly changed over time over the past 3 years. So I'm curious what everybody else kind of spends the majority of their time on. I often hear business operations or administrative, not in the sense of an EA, but in the sense of kind of keeping the operations bus humming. So getting the inbox to 0, Trisha, I hear you. Salome, my team is probably laughing because I am an aspiring inbox 0, but I essentially never deliver because the influx is pretty significant. Executive meetings is huge. Preparing for, leading, facilitating, being an active participant in is huge. And follow up, I think that's kind of that operational rigor. I empathize with that. So on the next slide, this, it's probably roughly accurate, but when I first came into the job, this is how I would say, roughly speaking, my time was allocated. I think you'll all appreciate this. The first time I did it, it added up to, I think, 220%. That's not how math works. So I had to rethink how it was, but I think it often feels like that. And so optimizing is what I would call, facilitating these executive meetings, getting your inbox to 0, the stuff that, man, it takes a lot of time. Strategic programs, this is like this idea of an incubator where you have projects and programs that you're accelerating forward. When we talked earlier about parallel strategic initiatives and this person coming in as the business owner until it finds its permanent home. And then, like I said, comms was a huge portion of my time, making sure that I was doing executive communications, internal communications. As I said, I had a background in that, so was able to lean in pretty quickly. And then culture is sort of, it's such a broad term, but the idea is, spending time with teammates. I think I very quickly became, and I feel very, very honored to have been a confidant for certain people who maybe weren't super comfortable speaking to the CEO, or as the company grew and scaled, they weren't sure who to go to for things like that. And so I think culture showed up a lot in that way and still does. And I think it's a real privilege as a chief of staff to be trusted in that capacity. Let me pause for a second. Cassie has a question. I'm curious how your role as a chief of staff partners with other internal comms and HR functions, given your focus in those areas. It's such a good question. The majority of how it shows up is in this strategic programs category. And so I'll give you a perfect example. We acquired a company that falls under M&A, but at the time we acquired the company, we didn't have someone who did corporate development or who focused on M&A specifically. And so that was this cross-department initiative where you have to include finance, you have to include IT, huge collaboration with HR. And so I find that the bulk of my very strategic collaboration with them happens when there's a program or a project that needs to be pushed forward that doesn't necessarily have one perfect departmental owner. And HR specifically shows up a ton in communications, I would say especially internal comms, where that you could argue easily is all about creating an amazing employee experience, making sure people understand your goals and that they feel a sense of belonging and connection. And so a lot of what we do from an HR perspective, I think, shows up in internal communications. And then I think the third big area that you collaborate a lot with other internal leaders is in the optimizing and maybe operationalizing the CEO. So some other people mentioned preparing for executive meetings or facilitating those or being a partner within those. That I think offers a huge opportunity for you to act as another executive team member and participate with these other department leaders. On the next slide is year 3. So I'm 3 years into this job now. And so I looked at it and I said, well, how am I spending my time now? That's 3 years later and it's super distinct. As you can see, it's spread slightly more evenly. There's a reason why some are a little bit higher than others. And there are more things on the list. So it very quickly becomes completely unscalable. And you might see things that are higher, like BizOps is something that's newer to our team. And we have someone who's newer to the company and newer to the job running it. And so it's not that the volume of work is more than events. In fact, I would argue the other way. Events get super labor intensive and very time consuming. It's that based on the size and scale of my team right now, that's requiring more operational rigor and more support. So you might have the same thing that's showing up for you if you're a more seasoned chief of staff and you've been in the job. It's also something that if you're going to the role to watch out for, that how it's described right now and how you launch into it has so much opportunity to flex and grow. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Rashmi posted a question too, also wondering how companies and orgs differentiate between a chief of staff and a head director manager of special projects. Seen companies with both, so curious if those roles end up overlapping with another. I completely agree. I actually have a woman on my team who reports to me who is director of special programs or strategic programs, and she also runs business operations. So I think special projects and special programs is one of those, can show up in lots of different departments. For us, we're pretty conservative about that title, and we've allocated it to one person. And the way that role is kind of delineated is they are responsible for owning the relationship with our majority stake investor, which also represents most of our board of directors, and all of the programs and priorities that they care the most about, which of course overlap with what Gainsight's objectives and goals are. And so she's creating kind of this living ecosystem of representing our largest stakeholder, making sure communication is happening to them really well, ensuring that all of that shows up then in how we focus our efforts and document our goals, our objectives, our key results in our one-page strategic plan and our goal setting tool. So I think there can be a lot of overlap. That's how we've designed it here. So in the chat, is there something for the people who are in the chief of staff now, the chief of staff role now, is there something that you spend your time on now that wasn't necessarily part of the original charter? And while people drop that in the chat, I see David had a question. Have you ever had to substitute a C-level during your time as chief of staff? If you've done so, how did you manage your time? Yes and no. We had one of our C-level individuals go out on an extended leave. And so while I didn't necessarily, and maybe, this could have been the right or the wrong decision, we didn't actually have a 100% stand-in. There was someone who was on their team who was kind of a next level down VP senior director who stepped up in the majority of the capacity. I think from a representation at our leadership level and partnering with them, we then kind of took a few bits and pieces that were lacking and provided them as things that the CEO then owned, which by default I owned. So anything related to preparing for the board of directors or preparing what we would need to present to our majority stake investor, I would have a hand in coordinating that. But we wanted to also champion our team growing and developing. And I think with people going out temporarily, it also offers an opportunity for people really interested in that career track to step up into a leadership position. So it's a little bit of a fuzzy answer, yes and no. And I think the time management is super key. Honestly, my biggest trick of the trade is figuring out what's in scope and what's out of scope. If the charter has changed and you now are running a department or you now are working on this massive project, have a clear communication with your principal about, now that this is present, this is what has to fall off my plate to make it sustainable, and make sure those are super clean agreements, because time is super finite.
Amazing.
And yeah,
thank
Donald,
you.
I'm happy to, go ahead, please.
No, thank you. Thank you. I think that was
You're
a
welcome,
great advice.
David. Oh, good. I'm glad. That's a hard one. I really appreciate that question. And yeah, I'm happy to share the one-page strategic plan. I'll find a link to that, and I'll find a link to the SWOT plan as well, and share those maybe after the fact. Clara could help me, or Carly could help me distribute them. Okay, we'll go back and then I'll answer some more questions too. These are so good. And yeah, I see a lot of the comments, managing staff, your team growing, those are a lot of the areas that were not in my scope and now are. Okay, so let's move into the scaling category, 2 slides ahead, Sal. And actually there's some really good questions in here. So before I do that, I'd love to hear what other roles make up I will get to that, Stephanie. I got a slide on that. How does your role relate to the leadership team? On the leadership team, it's made up of the president, the CEO, and the highest level person, each of them. Yes. All right, Stephanie, that question is so good. So I will come back to you on what's the makeup of the office of the CEO. It's actually in this section. And then this, I think, is where we could even take a peek back at the 3 menu options of chief of staff, the builder, the influencer, and the shaper. And so the way that Gainsight has kind of thought about this role is it is a leadership level. I'm in a SVP level role. I have a team. I run an office of the CEO. There are sort of department-esque functions that report into me that I don't evangelize or help another leader do, but my team owns it. And so I happen to sit on the leadership team as a parallel peer voice to the rest of the C-suite. Our model is the same as yours too. All the department leaders kind of represent our executive staff. And so, I feel very fortunate to be included in that, because I think the model can be very different. I've been at companies where the chief of staff is the one facilitating, making sure the meeting is excellent, but is not an active voice in the room. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities to lean into that. I think my biggest piece of advice there is to align very closely with your principal, to set clear expectations, and then use that person to set expectations in the room. If they're going to be hearing more of your voice, the burden doesn't have to be 100% on you to reshape your participation and communicate that. I think you can leverage your principal in that way as well. Awesome. So let's pop back to scaling. So I had 5 steps, as you can see. I really like, like the 3 or the 5, nice, clean numbers there. So I have 5 ways that I think about scaling the role. So the way to think about scaling is, you've gotten into the job and now you've figured out at what kind of level are the expectations. You've asked the right questions to make sure you're prioritizing and focused on the right things. You're flexible and you're agile because your priorities are changing, your focus areas are growing, and your time is getting spread thinner and thinner. And so now you're figuring out how to scale. And I think this is about scaling yourself, scaling your team, scaling your impact on the business, And so I want to talk through 5 ways that I think about scaling now, having seen it once before, and I'm sure other people have different ideas too. So the first one is establishing your mission. And on the next slide, in each of these, I'm going to give you an example. And so on the next slide, this is the mission of my team at Gainsight. We're on a mission to deliver world-class execution of Gainsight strategy, scale the CEO, all while accelerating our human-first movement and community. And so a little bit later, I'm going to show you exactly what those mean and how that shows up. But this, especially as you're building a team, and especially as you're describing to other teammates internally at the company, other executives, Stephanie, back to your point, how you kind of champion what it is you do and create more of a voice for yourself. People, every company has a mission statement for exactly this reason. It gives people something to rally around. It gives people something to connect to. It gives people something to connect to each other, then also on their team. So this is what we co-created on my team as our mission statement. And there's a lot in here, but I think it's clear enough that when you provide it to other teammates in our company or you share it externally, it ignites some questions of, oh, tell me a little bit more about that. But I think it's aspirational and it's gives us all something that we're driving toward. So I'd encourage you to start with that of what are we actually trying to do? What would success look like if we were accomplishing it? And then the second step is focusing your priorities. So now we know what we're charging toward and what we're all rallying around. How do we figure out exactly how we're going to focus our priorities and what we do? So on the next slide, you're going to see this double click into the 3 blue words that you saw in the mission statement: executing, scaling, and accelerating. And so I then get a little bit more specific. All right, so when I say executing, we're executing Gainsight's operating rhythm. That's business operations. It's everything that keeps the business humming. That turns our strategy into action. We've had all these great ideas for what we're going to do at Gainsight, but how do we make it actionable? And how do we make sure our teammates are super well aligned as we go through that whole process of our operating rhythm? Scaling, this is what I think about as like the nuts and bolts. A lot of times this is a full-time chief of staff job, without a doubt. That is scaling Nick, he's our CEO, and creating a world-class office of the CEO. Honestly, you might have 90% of your chief of staff job scaling your principal. And I think that is completely realistic. And then the third is this idea of acceleration. So we're accelerating our human first movement and community. Our mission statement is to be living proof that you can win in business while being human first. So that whole idea of this kind of human component, I think there's a lot of what my team focuses on in that respect as well. And then you get one more level specific on the next slide, which is great. So what does that mean on a day-to-day basis? Well, here's all the stuff we do to execute the operating rhythm, everything from developing the strategy all the way through to our weekly all hands that we host and the metrics that we produce. I could probably spend a whole 60-minute segment on what all of these are, but I will spare you right now, but I'm happy to talk more about those. The pink category there is scaling the CEO or creating an office of the CEO. And so this is efficiency, operationalizing what it is that you do, documenting and publishing what makes your CEO successful or makes your principal super successful, whether that's documenting and publishing it internally or creating some best practices for the CEO's success or your success as a team collaborating. And then this is where this incubator idea comes in of you've got a strategic project or program. This is how you might be scaling and creating more strategic horsepower behind your team. And then the last one, this is always my favorite category. I just, you put human first stamp over anything and it gets me excited. For us, we run executive communications, internal comms, all of global internal events live on my team. We have a lot of community programs. And then one of the functions that's never existed that my team has built is our social impact programming and anything we do related to philanthropy and impact. So, as you can imagine, that falls really nicely under this idea of a human first movement. And then step 3 is setting clear goals. So now we know what we're working on, we're prioritized, we've got focus, but then we have to figure out exactly what success will look like. So on the next slide, this is our design and our take on the one-page strategic plan. If you Google it, it's going to look way different online and probably way more robust. But we took our own sort of literary license, but the nuts and bolts are the same. So you're welcome to this too. So what you'll see is it's a journey of, this is what our team, my team is tackling. On the left are in blue, the blue category are the corporate level objectives. So this is what Gainsight is setting out to do in fiscal year 23. And then we get specific to my team. What is the office of the CEO? What's our mission? What's our charter? What are we getting up and doing every day? And then that's when you get more granular and you say, all right, here are our department priorities. This is what my team is focused on. Honestly, this isn't finished. So this is just like a super quick first blush. We're in the process in the next couple of weeks of actually making this robust. So I would say this probably for your team might need to be more specific. So that's my caveat on that. But this is where you say, what are the initiatives that we're going to focus on in order to achieve our mission? And then finally, in gray are the success metrics. How will we know we've been successful? And this is where you're probably familiar with SMART goals, making sure they're measurable and they're actionable, they're attainable. And so you're then tying each of the initiatives or priorities you're focused on to a metric for success. And then at the bottom, you have the corporate mission statement and then our values. I think about values as the salt and pepper seasoning. You sprinkle it over everything you do. They don't live in parallel to your priorities. They are what will make you successful at your priorities. It's, I think, a super fundamental. So there's kind of logic for where they are there. And then the second to last step, number 4 is building the team to achieve your goals. So Stephanie, this goes back to your question around what might that team look like. So on the next slide is the example of what my team looks like. This has been like a drip campaign. I didn't get all these people at once. There's that painful inflection point where you have to have enough work to justify the head count and have to be performing well enough to justify growing your team. So you're a little bit underwater and then you can justify the head count and build it. So I totally went through the same thing too. So what you're seeing on this slide is probably 2 years in the making. And I started with my amazing executive assistant, Salome, who's graciously screen sharing for me here. And then it grew over time. So the next hire I made was communications, the senior communications and community manager, because of the volume of communications that our CEO does and our company does, because of how seriously we take internal experiences and how we communicate and the level of transparency we have. That one made sense. The next role was this executive ops manager. And so that person is really tackling process documentation. They are an added layer of kind of security and operational rigor to the CEO's executive assistant. And they are oftentimes the person who's taking some of these early stage strategic projects and going and running with them. Next person we hired was the director of biz ops and strategic programs. That is a much more senior position. They are running all of the green category that you saw a couple slides ago of everything from how we're setting goals at the corporate level to how we're tracking those to then, like I said, communicating with our board of directors and really supporting that whole life cycle. And they also do more of the strategic programs that require someone with a bit more experience. And then the last 2 that I hired were internal events. That was a new function that moved from the marketing team to my team. It fit kind of nestled very nicely in this human first movement and employee experience. And then again, because of the volume of communications, this comms and support specialist is an extra layer of project support. We do a lot of deck and content production. We do a lot of blog post writing. And so someone with that skill set at an entry level was really important for us. Perfect. All right, before I move on, let's see. Erin, possibly aspiring chief of staff here. Chief of staff seems like an inherently high stress role. Which factors can help mitigate that? It is totally a high stress role. And one of the questions I get often is, how do you do it all? And my first response to that is that's the catch-22. I don't. There are things that drop. There are things that were in scope last week and then business priorities changed and they are no longer in scope. And so I think it goes back to setting clear boundaries and making the job sustainable by offering input in a really regular recurring basis, creating a nice environment with your principal about having candid real-time discussions about what you can do and by when. So again, I had said earlier about what's in scope and what's out of scope. And so I think coming with a recommendation of here's where we are in the field, here's what I believe are the biggest priorities that are going to move the needle on our business objectives. And because I'm focused on that, here's the stuff that's going to fall off my plate or I can't do, or I'm going to have to focus on next quarter and I'm deprioritizing that. I think honestly that the key to that is over communicating and then setting clear expectations and making sure you follow through on those expectations, even if the follow through means I overestimated, I didn't judge my time accordingly, and I wasn't able to do this. Being really proactive about that communication, I think, is super important. And then also, it's really easy when you're working alongside a very senior leader, or you are a senior leader yourself, to, I think, feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. Take vacation, sign off, take care of yourself. We're all human. And honestly, I don't believe in myself so much that the company can't go on without me. And I think actually the company is broken if you leave and things fall and drop and fall apart. I think the sign of a great company is when you have an awesome team or you have awesome peers who you can lean on to go and take care of yourself and take care of that stress too. Nicholas, regarding slide 4, do you lead all of these 6 plus 1 EA directly, or do they also report to the CEO? Great question. They all are direct reports to me. And then the executive assistant to the CEO reports directly to the CEO. I know a lot of companies, the EA to the CEO also reports to the chief of staff. That's not our design here, but yes, all 6 of those report to me. And the executive assistant, Salome, is wonderfully my executive assistant. So she's super helpful in a lot of the operational and administrative components on our team. And then Rashmi, what's been your approach at Gainsight when transitioning ad hoc projects and programs that don't have a clear owner, or your team's working on to a specific leader or business once that project or program is getting off the ground? Awesome question. So I use again, my principal is the CEO. I do a lot of campaigning early and including those people in the project. I think one of the biggest misses is if you take a project, you go and you run with it, and then you bring it back fully baked without consulting the individuals who probably should own this permanently from that perspective. So M&A, for example, if we're about to acquire a company, I go and I take that and I run with it and I do everything that needs to happen. And then I come back and I present it to the finance team, who maybe ultimately will own M&A in the future if we hire someone, or even temporarily they own it. I think you're doing a disservice to yourself. I think you're creating a single point of failure. And so being on that campaign, it takes a lot more work. It's like herding cats, bringing people along the journey, involving people in the decision-making process, and creating a clear delineation of roles and responsibilities, I think is a really important kind of step-by-step journey to get there. And then use your principal to set expectations. So it's not always on you to say, okay, this thing is done and now I'm transitioning it to its proper home. I think that's where you can say, as the champion and creating a force multiplier for your CEO, for me in this case, you're saying, great, I think it's time that you communicate expectations to its permanent home. Here's how I'd recommend doing this. And here are the steps we would take to make that transition seamless. I think it doesn't have to all be on you. And then I'll come back to a few other questions. I'll just hit quickly on this last couple slides here, and then I'm super excited. I'll come back to some more questions. So step 5 is recognizing your scope and impact. And so this part is about you, because I think a lot of chiefs of staff are super helper oriented. They really want to help their leader and help the business and give. This goes back to Erin's question around high stress. It's, that can be depleting sometimes too. And so when you get your scope increased, your responsibilities, your impact increases, you should be recognized for that too. And so on the next slide, this is just an example. I wanted to take you all along the journey of how this happened for me. So I came into the role as a senior director, and then I was promoted to VP. And then, as you all know, the more senior you get, the fewer and further between promotions get, and the more you have to do the work in a sustained period of time in order to earn a promotion. most of the time promotions happen because you were already performing at the early stages of that level, and now you're being promoted into it. And so it's like this catch-22. You got to do enough and do it well enough to earn the job at the level you're already performing. And so what I did here, and this is just about like taking care of yourself and seeing growth, especially if you're in the role for a longer period of time. Really specifically, I was looking to champion myself being promoted into an SVP role. It took a long time and a long time of championing, but I made this airtight case. I went through the criteria for an SVP level person. I mapped it to what I currently do today, which demonstrates sustained performance in the role. And then I said, cool, if you put me in an SVP role, here's the service line expansion you can expect from me, meaning here's what I'm going to do more of at this level to warrant an SVP level chief of staff. And by the way, just so you know, I can't be successful in doing that unless I have a team. So here's the talent I need in order to deliver what I just told you that I can deliver at this level. And then here's what's telling you in that third column that I am already performing at this level. And so this, it was a long time in the making. There's a lot of documentation, but I think as you grow and elevate, you are your best advocate. No one is going to advocate for your job or your promotion quite like yourself. And so that was the process I went through, kind of bookending all of this scope and increase in responsibilities and a growing team. And then just to kind of close this out, and then I'll go back to all the questions. On the next slide, I remember going into college and I really envied all these people who knew exactly what they wanted to do. They came in, they said, I want to be a nurse or I want to be an engineer and I have a 5-year plan. And I always felt super inadequate that I couldn't articulate, this is exactly what I want to do in 5 years. Honestly, I still can't, because every time I think I'm going to do something 5 years from now, it ends up being totally different and so much better than I could have imagined. But I felt like I had no concrete skills to offer and I wasn't good at this like very concrete thing like other people were. And then I remember my mom advising me on the fact that I have a really strong set of values and I'm a great communicator. And honestly, I was like, cool, that's not going to get me a job. It's not going to make me successful. And then on the next slide, I found this company called Bridgewater. They're a hedge fund based in Connecticut, and they operate based on literally hundreds of principles. And the founder of the company, Ray Dalio, has literally written a book, earth-shattering title, called Principles. And one of the principles that really shaped, I think, the way that I operate and guides the way that I manage the team on the next slide is this concept of values over abilities over skills. So this is a Twitter post where the founder had said, values are what make all the difference. Skills are these learned tools, abilities and aptitude. That's the way you think and behave. These can be compensated for with practice and hard work, but really values, that's like the bread and butter. They're these deep-seated beliefs. They dictate how we work together. They dictate how you motivate behaviors. People will fight for their values and their beliefs. You see this all over the world for good and bad. And so fast forward to this whole concept of this chief of staff role. This position, I think, comes with a weight of responsibility. You represent yourself, you represent the company, you represent your principal, the CEO. And so you need an airtight set of values that are aligned to your company and the leader you support. And so you haven't been part of an M&A deal before. You haven't led this HR program. So what? You can learn that because you're all smart and agile and adaptable. And trust me, I am proof of that. Half the things I lead, trust me, I have no business leading, but you learn it and you surround yourself by the right tools. And on the next slide, this job is hard. I think there's no kind of ifs, ands, or buts about it. But like I said, you're all in it or aspiring to it because people believe in you and you're agile and you're smart and you're capable. It is definitely no walk in the park. And on the next slide, as I said before, this is our mission statement at Gainsight: to be living proof you can win in business while being human first. And so I think this is kind of the perfect bookend to this idea of chief of staff. This position is a blend of strategic work and the ability and skill level to do it that shapes the business direction and your leader's impact and influence. But you're doing it all with this value-centric, human-first touch, which I think is what creates an outstanding chief of staff and what is often undervalued and under-focused on. And so I know that's all hard. So on the last slide here, there's this great article. It's lonely near the top, but I think with awesome people like you all, this amazing group and cohort of individuals we have here. I know I have a lot to learn from you. And so I hope this was helpful and gave you some of the nuts and bolts to be successful in your jobs.